My husband threw me out of our home at midnight to marry his young, curvaceous mistress. But the next morning I moved into my $30 million Malibu mansion while his mother screamed the words that would haunt her forever. You threw away a billionaire. I want you to picture it. My husband, Julian, stood in the doorway of the house I'd kept warm for 3 years, my suitcase already thrown onto the wet driveway, and beside him stood Celine, 24, glowing, the mistress he'd hidden for over a year. And his mother, Vivian? She laughed. She actually laughed as I stood there in the rain and said, "Did you really think you'd keep him? Look at her. Now look at you." They thought they were trading up. They thought they were throwing out a nobody. A plain, quiet wife with a small job and no name worth mentioning. But what none of them knew, what I had buried so carefully for 3 years, was exactly who I was before I ever married their precious son. Because I never married Julian for his family's fading money. I married him to be loved as a nobody, and my late father had made very sure that the moment they discarded me, they'd discover the most expensive mistake of their lives. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because by the time Vivian understood what her son threw away that night, it was already far, far too late. The rain hit my shoulders like tiny needles, cold enough to make my teeth ache. And I remember thinking how strange it was that the sky was crying harder than I was. I hadn't cried yet. I was too stunned to cry. 3 years of my life stood zipped inside a suitcase on a driveway, and the porch light above the door buzzed like it always did, flickering the way it had flickered every night since we moved in. Except tonight it was lighting up a stranger's face instead of mine. Julian didn't look at me the way a husband looks at a wife he's about to lose. He looked at me the way you look at a receipt after you've already thrown away the item. Done. Filed. Forgotten. "It's over, Margot," he said, and his voice was flat, like he'd rehearsed it in the car on the way home. "I want a life. A real one. Not this. Not this." 2 words that erased 3 years in half a second. Celine stood just behind his shoulder, her hand resting lightly on his arm like she already owned it. And she wasn't even trying to hide the smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She was beautiful in the way magazines are beautiful, polished, curated, aware of every angle of her own face. She didn't look at me like an enemy. She looked at me like I was already gone, like I was a chapter she'd already skipped past. And then Vivian stepped out from behind them both, wrapped in her cream silk robe even though it was almost midnight, her arms crossed, her chin lifted the way it always was when she talked to me, like she was looking down from somewhere I'd never be allowed to climb. "Did you really think you'd keep him?" she said, and she actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the rain. "Look at her." She nodded toward Celine. "Now look at you." I stood there in a soaked cardigan, my hair plastered to my face, holding nothing but the strap of my purse, and for one long moment, nobody said a word. The rain kept falling. The porch light kept buzzing. And I realized, with a strange, quiet clarity, that none of them were going to ask me a single question about who I was, or what I'd given up, or what I was leaving behind inside that house that had nothing to do with furniture. They just wanted me gone. So I picked up my suitcase. I want to take you back, just for a moment, to who I was before that driveway, because you need to understand what these people actually threw away, and you need to understand it before I tell you what happened the next morning. My name is Margot Hale. 3 years ago, when I met Julian at a fundraising dinner neither of us wanted to be at, I told him my name was Margot Hale, and that was true. What I didn't tell him, what I didn't tell anyone in that family, not once, not for one single day of our marriage, was that Hale wasn't just my name. It was my father's name, Desmond Hale. And if you've ever read a business magazine in the last 20 years, there's a chance you've seen that name before, usually next to a number with more zeros than most people see in a lifetime. My father built something enormous out of nothing. He started with a small logistics company in his 20s and turned it, decade by decade, into an empire that touched shipping lanes on 4 continents. By the time I was born, he was already wealthy beyond most people's imagination. But my father was not a man who believed money made a person better. If anything, he believed the opposite. He used to sit across from me at our kitchen table, a kitchen table, not a dining hall because he insisted on it, and tell me the same thing over and over like a prayer he needed me to memorize. "Margot," he'd say, The moment people know what you're worth, they stop seeing who you are. They start seeing a number. And once they see the number, they will never look past it again. He watched it happen to people his whole life. Friends who suddenly had opinions about how he should spend his money. Relatives who reappeared after decades of silence the second his company made headlines. Women who wanted to marry the empire and pretended, not very well, that they wanted to marry him. He watched trust corrode into transaction, over and over, until he almost stopped believing real love was possible for people like us. So when my mother died, I was 19, and it was just the two of us left in that enormous, quiet house. He made me a promise, and he made me swear one back. When I'm gone, he told me, you'll have everything. But before that day comes, I want you to know what it feels like to be loved for nothing but yourself. Go be nobody for a while, Margot. Just for a while. And if you find someone who loves the nobody, you'll know it's real. I laughed at him at the time. I was 22, grieving, and I thought it was one of his strange philosophical performances, the kind he gave at dinner parties to make himself sound wiser than the room. But 3 years later, when he passed away suddenly from a heart condition none of us saw coming, I found the paperwork already waiting. He'd set it all up long before he died. A trust, sealed under legal instructions so airtight that not even I could touch it until certain conditions were met. He wanted me to live modestly first. He wanted me to find out, with my own eyes and my own heartbreak if necessary, who would love me with nothing. So I changed nothing about my name because Hale is common enough that nobody thought twice about it, but I changed everything about my life. I moved into a small apartment. I took a normal job at a mid-sized marketing firm. I drove a car that rattled at highway speed. And when I met Julian at that fundraiser 18 months later, wearing a rented dress and sipping wine I could barely afford, I didn't tell him my father had built an empire. I told him I worked in marketing. Because for once in my life I wanted somebody to choose me, not my numbers. Julian was charming in the beginning, attentive. He noticed the little things, how I took my coffee, which side of the bed I liked, the way I got quiet when I was overwhelmed. His family had money too, or at least the appearance of it. An old real estate name that had been coasting for 2 generations on investments made by a grandfather none of them remembered how to replicate. Vivian wore her family name like a crown even as, unknown to me at the time, the crown was slowly rusting underneath. I married him in a small ceremony 18 months after we met, wearing my mother's earrings and nothing else that cost more than a few $100s. And for the first year I believed, genuinely, completely believed, that I had done exactly what my father asked. I had found someone who loved the nobody. But somewhere around the 2nd year, the cracks started showing, quiet at first, the way water damage starts behind a wall long before you ever see the stain. Julian began making comments about my job, small ones, disguised as jokes. Still doing the marketing thing? He'd say at dinner parties. Like it was a hobby I hadn't outgrown yet. Vivian started introducing me differently to new guests. Not as Julian's wife, but as Julian's wife, she does something in advertising. Said in the same tone you'd use to describe a stain on a carpet you were hoping nobody would notice. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself families take time to warm up to each other. I cooked dinner every night that Julian came home late, and toward the end, he came home late almost every night. I ignored the perfume that wasn't mine on his collar and month after month. Telling myself it was cologne. Telling myself I was imagining things. Telling myself the woman I loved being for Julian didn't ask too many questions. Because the woman I loved being for Julian was quiet, patient, understanding. Everything Margot Hale, heiress, never had to be. I found out about Celine the way most wives find out. Not through confrontation, but through silence. Julian stopped reaching for me at night. He stopped asking about my day. His phone started facing screen down on every surface, a small habit that told an enormous story if you were paying attention. And by then, I was paying very close attention. I never confronted him with anger. That wasn't who I'd built myself to be in that house. Instead, I watched, quietly, the way my father used to watch people reveal themselves in small decisions repeated over time. I watched Vivian grow colder toward me and warmer toward a woman she introduced once, casually, as a friend of Julian's from the gym. I watched Julian's father stay silent at every dinner. The way men do when they've decided a conflict isn't worth the discomfort of resolving it. And I watched myself shrink, month by month, trying to take up less space in a house that had decided, long before that midnight, that it no longer wanted me in it. The night it finally broke wasn't dramatic in the way you'd expect. There was no scene, no shouting match building slowly to a climax. Julian came home at 11 and I was sitting at the kitchen table, our kitchen table, not a dining hall, the only thing about that house that ever reminded me of my father. And he looked at me the way you look at furniture you're planning to replace. "I want a divorce," he said. "I'm marrying Celine." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I asked him one question, quiet and steady. "How long?" 14 months, he said, like it was a number on a spreadsheet instead of a wound. 14 months. Almost the entire second year of our marriage. Almost every night I'd cooked dinner and waited. Every night I told myself I was imagining the distance. Every ordinary evening I spent loving a man who was already gone. He didn't wait for me to process it. He went straight to the closet, pulled my suitcase down himself and started packing it with his own hands. Fast, efficient, the way you clean up a mess you're embarrassed by. Celine was already in the driveway when he opened the front door. She must have been waiting outside. Must have known exactly what tonight was going to be. And Vivian came down the stairs in her robe like she'd been waiting for the show to start. That's when the laughter happened. That's when she said the words that echoed in my head the entire time I stood there getting soaked in the rain. "Did you really think you'd keep him? Look at her. Now look at you." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I picked up my suitcase from the wet concrete and I walked to my car and I drove until I found a gas station parking lot 3 miles away, and I sat behind the wheel with the engine running for warmth, and for the first time since my father died, I let myself cry the way I hadn't let myself cry in years. Not for Julian, not really, but for every version of myself I had folded smaller and smaller, trying to fit into a life that was never going to hold me. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the rain to stop. Long enough for the sky to start turning that pale gray color right before dawn. And it was in that gray hour, phone in my lap, that I finally opened the one contact I hadn't touched in 3 years. The private number for Halloway and Cross, my father's estate attorneys, the ones who'd been holding my full inheritance in trust, waiting for exactly this kind of night. I typed 4 words. "I think it's time." The response came faster than I expected, considering the hour. "A car will be there within the hour, Ms. Hale. Please remain where you are." I sat in that gas station lot, mascara down my cheeks, heartbreak still raw in my chest, and somewhere underneath all of it, something else began to stir. Something my father had planted in me years before Julian ever existed. Something patient and quiet that had been waiting for this exact moment to finally wake up. By the time the black car pulled into that gas station lot, headlights cutting through the last of the morning fog, I wasn't the same woman who'd been thrown out onto a wet driveway just hours earlier. I was about to become someone Julian, Celine, and Vivian had never once bothered to imagine. The black car that pulled into that gas station lot didn't look like anything special. A quiet sedan, dark windows, engine humming low like it was trying not to disturb the morning. But when the driver stepped out and opened the back door for me, and I saw the woman waiting inside, sharp gray suit, silver hair pulled back tight, a leather folder resting on her lap like it held something sacred, I understood that this was the first hour of a life I had spent 3 years pretending didn't exist. "Ms. Hale," she said, and her voice was calm in a way that made my chest ache, because nobody had said my full name like that in years. Not Julian's wife, not the woman in advertising, just Margot Hale, exactly as I was born. "My name is Eleanor Voss. I worked with your father for 11 years. I am so very sorry we're meeting again under these circumstances. But I promise you, everything is exactly as he intended." I climbed into that car with wet hair, smudged makeup, and a suitcase still damp from the driveway, and Eleanor didn't ask me a single question about the divorce, about Julian, about the mistress or the mother-in-law's laughter. She simply opened the leather folder, pulled out a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark wax, and placed it gently in my lap. "Your father asked that you read this only once you were somewhere safe," she said. "We're almost there." I stared out the window as the city thinned into coastline, as gray asphalt turned into winding roads lined with eucalyptus trees, as the ocean began flickering between the hills like something remembering how to breathe. My hands were shaking, not from the cold anymore, but from something closer to disbelief. Every mile we drove felt like peeling back a year of my life I had frozen on purpose. About 40 minutes later, we slowed in front of a tall iron gate, and beyond it, sitting on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, was a white mansion so quietly enormous it didn't need to announce itself. Wide glass windows caught the early light. A garden, impossibly green, ran down toward a cliffside where the ocean crashed white against dark rock. Eleanor entered a code, and the gate opened without a sound, like it had been waiting. I stepped out of the car into salt air and stood there the way you stand in front of something too large to believe. Eleanor placed a set of keys in my hand, heavier than I expected, cool against my palm. "This home has belonged to your family trust for 9 years," she said. "Your father purchased it quietly under a separate holding company, specifically for this day. He believed that no matter when your marriage ended, and he always feared it might end exactly like this, you deserved somewhere untouched by anyone who had ever hurt you. Somewhere entirely only yours." I looked at the keys. I looked at the house. And then, finally, I opened the envelope. My father's handwriting greeted me the way it always had. Slightly slanted, ink pressed hard into the page, the handwriting of a man who wrote like he was running out of time even when he wasn't. "Margot, if you are reading this, then the marriage has ended, and I imagine it has ended in a way that hurt you far more than it should have. I am so sorry I am not there to hold you through it. But I want you to know something before you feel anything else. This house was never a consolation prize. It was never built for heartbreak. I bought it the year after your mother died. In the same season I asked you to go live an ordinary life for a while, because I already knew, even then, that one day you would need a place where nobody could ever again make you feel small. This is not the end of your story, Margot. This is only the room where the truth finally gets to breathe." I read those words twice, then a third time, sitting on the front steps with the ocean roaring below me, and for the first time since that driveway, I didn't cry from grief. I cried because somebody, even from beyond death, had built me an exit before I ever knew I'd need one. Eleanor let me sit with it for a while before she spoke again. "There are more letters," she said gently. "Your father left very specific instructions about when each one should be opened. We'll be in touch about the rest. For now, please go inside. Rest. This is yours." I walked through that house room by room that morning, my footsteps echoing off floors that had never known my grief, and everything about it felt less like wealth and more like breath, like exhaling after holding something in for 3 years. I didn't get long to enjoy the silence. By early afternoon, the gate buzzer sounded, sharp and unfamiliar, and the small screen by the door showed a car I recognized instantly. Julian's father's car, the one Vivian always insisted on being driven in 4 appearances. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart hammering, because I hadn't called anyone. I hadn't told a single soul where I was. Word had already reached them anyway. I asked the gate guard to let them through, mostly out of curiosity, mostly because some small part of me wanted to watch what happened when a family that measured every human being by their bank account finally discovered they had misjudged the ledger completely. Vivian walked through the front door first, still in that same cream robe from the night before. She must have come straight from the house without changing. Her eyes darting across the marble floors, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the ocean view stretching endlessly behind me. Julian followed her, and for the first time since I'd known him, I watched something other than confidence sit on his face. Celine trailed a few steps behind, arms crossed, glancing around like she was trying to calculate square footage in her head. Nobody said hello. Nobody asked how I was. "Explain this," Vivian said, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. Stripped of the honeyed condescension she usually wrapped around every sentence aimed at me. "Explain this right now." "My father left it to me," I said simply. She laughed, though it came out thinner this time, less certain than the laugh from the driveway the night before. "Your father worked in shipping. A logistics manager," Julian said. "This is," she gestured wildly at the windows, the art, the ocean. "This is not a logistics manager's house." "My father's name," I said quietly, "was Desmond Hale." I watched the exact moment the name landed. Vivian's face didn't move for a full 3 seconds, and then it drained, slowly, the way color drains from the sky at dusk. Not all at once, but in a way you can't quite look away from. Julian's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Celine, to her credit, was the only one who seemed to have no idea what the name meant at all, glancing between them, confused by a silence she didn't understand. "That's impossible," Julian finally said, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard from him. "Desmond Hale died over 2 years ago. Everyone knows Desmond Hale's daughter is—" He stopped. "Is what?" I asked. "Go on. Finish it." He didn't. He couldn't. Because the answer was standing right in front of him, in a soaked cardigan the night before, and in front of him now in a plain sweater, holding the keys to a $30 million mansion his family hadn't even known to dream about. Vivian's hand found the doorframe like she needed it to stay upright. "You," she whispered. "You're—" And then, all at once, whatever composure she'd built her entire identity around simply collapsed, and the scream that came out of her wasn't rage, wasn't even shock exactly. It was something closer to grief, the specific grief of watching a fortune slip through your fingers the instant you finally understood it had been there all along. "You threw away a billionaire," she said, and then said it again, louder, like saying it twice might undo the last 12 hours. "You threw away a billionaire." She turned on Julian with a fury I don't think he'd ever seen from her, not even as a child. "How did you not know? How did you not check? 3 years, Julian. 3 years, and you never once thought to ask who her father was?" Julian stood there, pale, his jaw working uselessly, and for the first time in our marriage, I watched him look genuinely, completely lost. Not lost like a man discovering he'd made a mistake. Lost like a man realizing the mistake could never be fixed. "Margot," he started, and his voice had changed entirely, softened into something desperate, something I hadn't heard since the earliest months of our marriage. "Margot, wait. Let's talk about this. Celine and I, we haven't. Nothing's official yet, we could." "Stop," I said, and I didn't raise my voice because I didn't need to. "Last night you packed my suitcase with your own hands. Last night your mother laughed at me on our driveway. You don't get to stand in my house today and pretend last night didn't happen just because the math changed." Celine, finally understanding the shape of what she'd walked into, took a small step backward, glancing at Julian like she was reconsidering every promise he'd made her in the last 14 months. Vivian, meanwhile, had recovered just enough of herself to attempt one last angle, her voice shifting from panic into something colder, more calculating. "Margot," she said, and it was the first time in 3 years she'd used my name without a trace of condescension in it. "You have to understand, families argue. This was a misunderstanding. We can fix this. Julian still loves you. He was just confused. The stress of—" "The affair was 14 months long," I said. "That's not confusion. That's a choice. Repeated, over and over, until it became easy." Nobody spoke after that. I walked to the front door and opened it, the ocean air rushing past me into the entryway, carrying salt and the distant cry of gulls, and I looked at all 3 of them standing there. The mother who mocked me in the rain, the husband who packed my bags with his own hands, the mistress who thought she'd won something worth having. "I think it's time for all of you to leave," I said. Vivian stared at me, waiting, I think, for me to change my mind the way people like her always assumed I would, because for 3 years I always had. I didn't. Julian opened his mouth one more time, and I simply shook my head, and something in that small gesture made him finally understand there was nothing left to say. They walked out one by one, Celine first, practically fleeing toward the car, Vivian next, her chin no longer lifted the way it always had been, and Julian last, pausing at the threshold the way people do in movies right before the line that's supposed to matter. "This isn't over," he said quietly. I almost laughed because I'd heard those exact words before, spoken by people who genuinely believed threats could undo consequences. "It already is," I said, and closed the door. The house went quiet again, save for the waves rolling endlessly against the cliffs below, and I stood there in the entryway of a home I hadn't even slept in yet, my heart pounding not with grief this time, but with something unfamiliar, a kind of settling, a kind of ground finally forming underneath feet that had been sinking for 3 straight years. That evening, Eleanor called to check on me, her voice careful, gentle. "There's a second letter," she said. "Your father left instructions that it only be opened once the family had learned the truth. I believe that condition has now been met." I sat by the window as the sun began sinking into the water, the sky bruising into orange and violet, and I broke the seal on the second envelope with hands that had finally stopped shaking. My father's handwriting greeted me again, and the first line stopped my breath entirely. Margot, if they know now, then I imagine there was a woman involved, and I imagine my son-in-law is currently regretting a decision he cannot undo. But that isn't the reason I asked Eleanor to wait. There's something else you need to understand before you go any further. Something about the 14 months you just found out about, and something about a promise I made long before you ever met Julian at all. I stopped reading for a moment, the ocean wind moving softly through the open window. Because something in that sentence told me the truth I'd learned that day was only the surface of something much deeper still waiting beneath it. Before we dive into the final scene, if you haven't already, take a second to subscribe to this channel and turn on that notification bell, because stories like Margot's are only getting more powerful from here, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's finish this journey. The letter trembled slightly in my hands, not from the wind moving through the open window, but from something inside me that already sensed I wasn't ready for what came next. I read on, my father's voice rising off the page the way it always did, steady, patient, like he was sitting across from me at that old kitchen table instead of speaking to me from somewhere I could never reach again. Margot, the 14 months you learned about today were not the beginning of the end. They were only when it became visible. I need you to understand something painful, something I debated for years whether to ever tell you at all. Julian's family has been drowning in debt since before you ever met him. Not struggling, drowning. Failed investments, a real estate portfolio quietly collapsing, loans against loans, all of it hidden behind galas and old family names that meant nothing anymore except the appearance of meaning something. Vivian knew. She has always known. And 2 years into your marriage, when their finances became critical, she hired someone to look into your background, hoping, praying, that the quiet woman her son had married in a rented dress might have money hidden somewhere after all. I stopped breathing for a moment. The ocean outside kept moving, indifferent, endless, while everything inside me went completely still. They found nothing conclusive, my father continued, because you had done exactly what I asked of you. You had buried Desmond Hale's daughter so carefully that even a professional investigator only found fragments, rumors, nothing solid enough to act on. But fragments were enough to make Vivian suspicious that you might be worth more than you appeared. And so, rather than risk waiting to find out, rather than risk staying loyal to a marriage that might or might not pay off, she made a decision. She found Celine's family instead, new money, connected, eager to marry into whatever remained of the family name. And she encouraged Julian toward a sure thing instead of gambling on an uncertain one. Margot, they didn't throw you away because you were worthless to them. They threw you away because they weren't certain enough that you were worth keeping. That is so much crueler than simple cruelty. That is calculation wearing the mask of heartbreak. I set the letter down on my lap, my hands pressed flat against the paper like I could steady myself against it. And for a long moment I simply stared out at the water, watching the last light bleed out of the sky. Every cruel comment Vivian had ever made, every cold introduction, every time she glanced past me like I was furniture in her son's life. All of it rearranged itself in my mind into something with edges and intention. It wasn't that they never valued me. It was that they gambled and lost, and only found out the true stakes after the hand was already folded. I picked the letter back up, my eyes finding the final lines. There's one more thing, Margot, and this is the part one need you to hold gently, because it isn't about money at all. Before your mother passed, she made me promise something I have carried every single day since. She told me she was afraid you would spend your whole life believing love had to be earned through smallness, through shrinking, through proving, through making yourself easy to keep around. She asked me to make sure that whatever happened to you, you would eventually learn the opposite. That you are not required to earn love by disappearing. I built this trust, this house, this entire elaborate plan not to punish anyone who ever hurt you, but to give you the one thing money actually, Margot, was never the mansion. It was never the money, or the moment Vivian finally understood what she'd lost. The point was always this: I wanted you to know, beyond any doubt, beyond any manipulation or gamble or cruel calculation another person might make, that you are worth loving exactly as you are, with nothing attached to your name. You already proved that to yourself the moment you chose to live quietly for those years, working an ordinary job, loving an ordinary life, giving someone the chance to love the nobody instead of the number. That wasn't naivety, Margot. That was the bravest thing I ever watched you do. Julian failed that test. Vivian failed it before he even had the chance to. But you passed it every single day, for 3 long years, even when it cost you almost everything. That's not a tragedy. That's proof of exactly who you are. I want you to build something with this house, something your mother would recognize if she could see it. Fill it with people who love you without needing a reason. Let it become a place where nobody ever again has to make themselves smaller to be welcome. And when you're ready, not before, but when you're truly ready, forgive them, not because they deserve it, but because carrying that bitterness will cost you far more than it ever costs them. I love you more than any number I ever built in my life could measure. That was always the whole point. I just needed you to finally believe it. I held that letter against my chest for a long time after I finished reading it. The ocean breathing in and out below me, the moon climbing slowly into a clear black sky, and I felt something settle inside me that I don't think I'd felt fully since my mother died all those years ago. Not happiness exactly, but peace. The particular, hard-won peace of finally understanding your own worth without needing anyone else's permission to believe it. The weeks that followed didn't unfold like a fairy tale, because real healing never does. Julian called several times, his voice sliding between apology and desperation. And once, humiliatingly, an actual proposal that we simply start over, now that everything's clear. I didn't answer that call with anger. I answered it with the same quiet steadiness my father had spent years building into me. You didn't lose me because of who my father was, I told him. You lost me the moment you decided 14 months of lying was easier than one honest conversation. The money just means you'll never get the chance to fix it. Vivian tried a different approach entirely. A lawyer's letter at first, questioning the validity of the inheritance, a last desperate grasp at control. It went nowhere because my father, ever patient, ever thorough, had built protections around that trust so airtight that no court in the country would have entertained it for more than an afternoon. When that failed, she tried warmth instead, an invitation to lunch, a soft voice on the phone that sounded nothing like the woman who'd laughed at me in the rain. I agreed to meet her once, mostly for my own closure rather than hers. She looked smaller across that restaurant table than she ever had in 3 years of towering over me at dinner parties. She apologized, eventually, in the careful, rehearsed way people apologize when they're hoping the apology buys back something they lost. I listened to all of it, and when she finished, I told her the truth as gently as I could manage. I forgive you, I said, because I don't want to carry what you did for the rest of my life. But forgiveness doesn't mean rebuilding what we never really had. You didn't lose a daughter-in-law that night, Vivian. You lost the chance to ever know me at all. She didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't wait for one. I paid for the meal, and I walked out into the sunlight, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the old, familiar urge to shrink myself smaller on my way out the door. Celine, I heard through mutual acquaintances months later, left Julian almost as quickly as she'd arrived. Once it became clear his family's fortune had been a mirage all along. I felt nothing when I heard that news. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a quiet, distant understanding that some people build entire lives on foundations made of nothing but appearance. And eventually, appearances always collapse under their own weight. As for me, I did exactly what my father asked. I filled that Malibu house with people who loved me without needing a single reason attached to my name. Old friends who'd known me back when I drove a car that rattled at highway speed. Neighbors who came for coffee and never once asked what the house was worth. A small scholarship fund I started in my father's name for young women trying to build lives independent of anyone else's fortune. The house stopped being a monument to what I'd lost and slowly, patiently, became something closer to what my father always intended. A place where I never again had to earn my welcome. Some nights, I still stand on that same balcony where I read his final letter, the waves rolling endlessly against the rocks below, and I think about that rainy driveway, about Vivian's laughter, about Julian's flat, rehearsed voice telling me it was over. And I don't feel anger anymore when I think of it. I feel something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds, because that driveway was the last night I ever spent trying to make myself small enough to be loved by people who were never capable of loving anything beyond a number. My father used to say that the moment people learn what you're worth, they stop seeing who you are. But he was only half right. Because some people, when they finally learn the truth, don't just see the number. They see, for the very first time, everything they were too blind, too greedy, or too afraid to notice before. Vivian saw it that afternoon in my entryway, and it broke something in her she'll likely never fully repair. Julian saw it the night his desperate phone calls went unanswered. And me. I saw it too, but not in the mirror, and not in Vivian's scream, and not even in my father's letters. I saw it in the quiet, ordinary years before any of this happened. The years I spent loved for absolutely nothing but myself, before a single dollar ever entered the conversation. That, I finally understood, was the real inheritance. Not the mansion. Not the trust. The proof, undeniable and mine forever, that I was worth loving long before anyone ever found out what I was worth. So before you go, I want to leave you with something to sit with tonight, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. If every dollar, every title, every impressive thing about your life disappeared tomorrow, would the people around you stay? And harder still, if you're honest with yourself, tonight in the quiet, do you already know the answer?